Hello, everyone, and welcome to Scrambled. Today, I'm honored to host Dr. Richard E. Korf, a truly pioneering figure in the field of artificial intelligence. As a professor of computer science at UCLA, Dr. Korf has shaped the landscape of heuristic search, problem solving, and planning. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So, my first question is, what drew you to puzzles like the Rubik's Cube as a way to solve or to study problem solving in AI?
So I think one of the earliest puzzles I got, I mean, it was I was a very small child, and I got a copy of what you may know of as the 15 puzzle. It's a 4 by 4 square frame
Okay,
with 15 numbered tiles and one blank. It
interesting.
was actually a 31 puzzle. My parents had got it for me, I think, in a gift shop in a hospital when a relative was ill.
Oh,
And I've just always been interested in puzzles. And I did my undergraduate and graduate work in computer science and AI in particular, which was
okay.
a rather different field in those days. And one of the things you did in AI, and you still do, is you look at some task and say, "Can I get a computer to do that task?"
Right.
And some of the earliest tasks were playing games like chess, solving puzzles, that sort
Yeah.
of thing. So it was a natural. I mean, the way you did research is you tried to figure out, okay, so what's a domain that would be interesting to try to get a computer to do it, and then you started figuring out how to write a program to do that.
Yeah. So I guess how did you kind of use Rubik's Cube in your computer science or AI like background?
So I used it actually at two different stages in my career, and they're somewhat different, but it's the same puzzle in each case. When I was doing my PhD thesis at Carnegie Mellon, probably starting around 1980, a program the program that formed the base of my thesis was a program that learned how to solve puzzles like the Rubik's Cube, the 15 puzzle, the Towers of Hanoi puzzle, you probably know,
Okay.
and some others. And so that was a program. It learned solutions. It didn't know a solution in advance, and it learned
Wow.
how to solve those puzzles. And then subsequent to that, in around I think the paper was published in 97, so it was done probably 96 or so, is I looked at the issue of a computer program that could find a shortest solution to a randomly scrambled cube.
Wow. Actually, hearing you describe this, you obviously know what like P versus NP is, right?
Heard of it?
Does this kind of have like any implications or relations to that? Because I'm kind of getting like similar vibes from it, but I don't know.
So I haven't really worked on that directly, but finding shortest solutions to a number of these problems have been proved to be NP hard, at least, or NP complete.
Okay.
I recall that this was done for the sliding tile puzzles, the 15 puzzle at one point. You can't do it for a particular size puzzle. You have to do it for a class of puzzles which can grow. So you can't say, for example, that 3 by 3 Rubik's Cube or the 15 puzzles NP complete because it's actually finite.
Right.
But you can say a puzzle of this type, if you allow it to grow, it's NP complete. And I don't, my guess would be, although I don't know that that's been done for Rubik's Cube, you may know better than I do.
I actually don't. So yeah, but that's interesting. Do you know actually how to solve Rubik's Cube?
I do not.
Okay, that's interesting. That's funny. Um, have you ever met any like speed cubers who have been interested by your work?
I've met a few, and I've sort of attracted a little bit of attention from some. I don't know any of them well.
Okay.
I've occasionally, gotten communication from some of those. The names are kind of escaping me now, but I
Okay.
haven't had a lot of communication with the speed cubing world.
Yeah. So how did you kind of get interested in like AI, I guess, like as I guess at your like first exposure as an undergrad or maybe even earlier.
So I went to MIT as an undergrad, and because one thing I knew at that point when I started was I was interested in science and engineering,
Okay.
and that seemed like a good place to go. And like most MIT undergrads, I went in with the idea of majoring in math or physics, and then I ended up doing what most MIT undergrads did, which is major in electrical engineering and computer science. It's one department there.
Yeah.
So my undergraduate degree is EECS, electrical engineering, computer science. And, I graduated with my bachelor's degree in 77. And, I actually first encountered computers in high school, a
Okay.
couple years before that. It may seem odd to you, but there wasn't, you didn't see a computer at all until high school in
Right.
those. in the early
Yeah, that
70s.
actually makes
And,
sense.
and I was just captivated, the fact that you
Yeah,
could, write a program to get this thing to do almost anything you wanted got me interested in computer science.
yeah,
And then within computer science, AI seemed like, probably the most exciting area because it was sort of trying to push the frontiers of what you could do with computer applications.
yeah. So how did that kind of like evolve in your career, I guess throughout your career? How did your like interests in computer science and AI like culminate into where you are like today?
So I did my bachelor's degree in effectively computer science, although it
Okay.
was ECS, and then I applied to graduate school. And as I mentioned, I went to Carnegie Mellon for graduate school,
Yeah.
and majored in computer science, got a master's and a PhD in computer science. And then I taught at Columbia
Oh wow.
University for 2 years as an assistant professor of computer
Okay.
science. And then I moved to UCLA in 19, so I graduated in 83,
Okay.
so I taught 83 and 84 at Columbia, and then 85 in July I moved to UCLA. And I've been there until about a couple of years ago when I retired. So my position was, assistant, then associate and full professor of computer science. So I just kind of stayed in the field throughout and stayed in AI as well.
Do your students ever bring up like Rubik's cubes at all? Or you ever talk about them with anyone?
I've had colleagues that have asked me and told students to do the same thing. They brought me Rubik's Cube and asked me to sign them, which I found kind of amusing. So
Oh wow, that's funny.
I guess I'm sort of known as kind of the Rubik's Cube guy, at least within sort of the computer science, one of
So
the Rubik's Cube guys within computer science.
okay. So apologize. I apologize for not like doing my research fully, but was the solver that you created like one of the first of its kind, or did it come like after other ones? Or I'm just
The
curious, like
optimal solver or the one to sort of that learned.
the one that I guess both actually. I'm curious how like either one.
So the learning program was based on some previous work that other people had done, but no one
Okay.
had actually, I don't think, applied it. It had actually done the work of actually applying it to Rubik's Cube. It was
Okay.
based on some work with permutation problems.
Yeah,
The,
so I
the
guess I'm talking
latter,
about the other one then. The
okay, so the latter one, I believe, and I think this is held up, that I was the first person to produce optimal solutions to randomly scrambled cubes.
wow.
And it relied on a couple simple ideas, but
That's amazing.
that seems to be the continues to be the sense I think of the community.
Yeah. Do you know if it's still like being used today in any capacity or like in modern
The
like
cube,
I
the cube.
I guess the algorithm like the or like the this like I guess whatever you developed like exactly
So
like
the algorithm, I don't know how much detail you want to go into. I'm not sure
actually I
what.
mean I think like some general surface level with maybe some like I guess some details would be nice because I know like the people watching this are probably not like I myself don't have like a in-depth background but it would be interesting to kind of hear like some of the
Okay,
technical
do
stuff.
your audience have a computer science background?
Not too heavily, but like it would be interesting to hear like details though, like that go like a little bit beyond surface level. So
Okay,
I'm
so there's a model of problem solving due to Herb Simon and Alan Newell, and Herb Simon was my thesis advisor,
okay. Yeah,
and
I actually I came across his name.
it's
When
called the problem space model. And the
okay,
idea is that you can model lots of problems as graphs, not in the sense of a chart, but in the sense of discrete nodes and edges. And the nodes typically represent states of the problem. And for Rubik's Cube, a node would represent, or a state would be a particular physical configuration of the cube. And then
okay,
edges connect nodes, and those edges correspond to legal moves. So you can
okay,
imagine a graph, and that graph, in the case of Rubik's Cube, as I'm sure you know, has about 10 to the 4 times 10 to the 19th states, I believe. Am I
okay.
getting this right? Yeah, about 4,
Like
10,
43 quintillion, I think, something
yeah,
like that. Yeah.
it's about 4.3 times 10 to the 19th, different states. There's another wrinkle I'll get to in a moment about
Okay.
that.
Yeah.
And so it's a very big graph. You never write it down.
Right.
It exists only implicitly in that if you have a computer representation of a state, computer representation of a configuration, you can generate the successor states. You can generate the neighboring states by applying a computer model of making a twist. So none of this was done with a physical cube. It was done with a computer model, a
Yeah.
software
Right. That
model
makes
of the
sense.
cube. And
Yeah.
so then the task becomes you start with some initial state, which is typically whatever scrambled state you start out in. And then you have a goal state, which with Rubik's Cube is typically the standard solve state where there's one color facing on every face. And the task now gets abstracted to find a path in that graph from the initial state to the goal state. In other words, find a sequence of moves that you can make that'll get you from the initial state to the goal state. And if you're looking for optimal solutions, you want a shortest possible such solution. Okay.
Yeah.
So before I come back to that, let me do a quick little detour here,
Okay.
which is, again, I'm sure you and your listeners probably know, if you actually look at the Rubik's Cube graph, there's really 12 different disconnected components. Each of them is that size, and they don't connect in the sense that you can't get from one to another. So if you take a cube and you take the stickers off and put them back in some random configuration,
Yeah.
you only have about a 1 in 12 chance anymore of ever being able to solve it. So there'll be a set of 4 times 10 to the 19th states that are connected for one particular state.
Right. Yeah.
And you can't get between them. And there's 12 different what are called orbits of the group. So we stay within one. And so then the problem is, how do you find, it's a problem of finding a sequence of moves that get you from the initial state to the goal state.
Right.
And what you use and so another example of that people are much more familiar with is, if you go to your car and you give it a location, you say, I want to go to this particular place, it knows where you are. It also has a problem space. It has a network of roads, which are locations, and it tries to find a route or a path from the current state to the goal state.
Yeah.
So these are called single agent pathfinding problems. They're different from two-player games like chess or checkers. There's a single agent, and you're looking for a sequence of moves, and you can use this model of finding a path in a graph to model all kinds of different problem-solving scenarios. So the 15 puzzle is another example of the same thing.
Yeah.
And Rubik's Cube is a particularly clean one. It's a finite problem space. The states are discrete. The number of legal operators is small, and they're well-defined. So at that point, you have a pretty well-defined problem. And now it's just a question of how do you go about doing it?
And if I can add real here, actually, something interesting about the pathway thing. So our family owns a Tesla, and then it has a feature called Smart Summon, which essentially it plots like a path from the parking spot to wherever you are. And on the app, you can see like the line between you and the car, like kind of fluctuating a little bit. And it's kind of fuzzy, but it kind of charts a path in a way like that accounts for like people, the parking space itself, like avoiding like collisions and like just the direction of road and all those like parameters. So I think is that something like kind of similar to what you were talking about?
Yeah, it's a more complicated scenario
Right,
because you're worried about obstacles and everything else. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's the same idea.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And so then the question is how do you do it? And
Right.
I'll give you a very simple idea, and then we'll look at a more complicated idea, which is, and this is the simplest idea is called brute force search. You start where you are, and you say, what are the states I can get to in one move? Let me generate all those states. And then for each one, you ask, is this the goal state? And if it is, you're done. And if not, what you do is you start over and you say, okay, what are all the states I can get to in 2 moves from my initial state?
Yeah.
Okay. And if the goal state is in there, you have a 2-move solution. And you keep incrementing that, right? So it should be clear that if you run that algorithm, in principle, that will give you a shortest solution. Now, it's not practical because it would take too long, because the typical, average sort of optimal solution length of a randomly scrambled cube is about 18 moves. And the branching factor is about 13.3. There's some details about that we can go into if you want, but it has a fairly large branching factor. So the number of states, in some sense, at a distance of 18 moves is about 13.3 to the 18th power. It's
Could you
huge.
explain a little bit about the branching factor? I think
Branching factor in a graph, as I've described, is the number of neighbors of a given node, the average number of neighbors.
Okay. Okay.
Often you ignore the one to the parent, so the one that goes back to the parent, so that it's
Right.
usually one less than that, right?
Yeah.
And these are the graphs we're talking about are what are called undirected, which means you can go in either direction on an edge. You can apply an operator either way. You can twist the cube one way, and then you can untwist it to get back to where you started.
Yeah.
Okay. So the branching factor is typically the number of neighbors of a node minus 1, and the 1 is for the move back to the parent.
Okay.
Okay. So if you want to search to a given depth, let's say 18 moves, and you've got a branching factor of 13 moves, say, then you've got, within one level, the number of states that are 1 move away is 13. The number that are 2 moves away is 13 times 13, which is about 169.
Yeah.
The ones that are 3 moves away is
Right.
13 times 13 times 13, and it just grows exponentially.
Yeah.
Okay, but that's an algorithm which in practice, in theory, will work.
Right.
In practice, it's not powerful enough to
Yeah.
solve the problem. So what you add to that is something called a heuristic evaluation function.
Okay.
Okay, and let me describe this. Are you fairly familiar with the sliding tile puzzles, the 15 puzzles I mentioned?
Not too much. I might like have one. I have a box of very like older and like interesting puzzles, but I've never actually like I don't really recall how it works.
Okay, so let's use a different example then.
Okay.
Let's use the example of finding a path in for your Tesla to find a path
Okay. Yeah.
from point. So we could do that brute force search,
Right.
but that would take a long time. And so what it
Yeah.
actually does is it makes use of another idea called a heuristic evaluation function. And a heuristic evaluation function is a function which takes a state and estimates the distance to the goal. Okay, how far you have to go. And so your Tesla typically, let's just assume it's looking for the shortest path. It may be looking at traffic and other kinds of things as well, and preferring freeways and other sorts of deals. But let's assume it just wants the shortest path. So an evaluation function gives you an estimate of the distance to the goal.
Yeah.
Okay. So a very simple evaluation function to understand in the map world is Euclidean distance, right? You take the current location, you take the goal location, and you compute the airline or straight line distance between those 2 points. You learn that in geometry, right? It's the difference
Right.
of the x coordinates squared
Yeah.
plus the difference of the y coordinates squared, and you take the square root of that. Okay.
Yeah.
So when you're armed with that, your search becomes more efficient because, for example, if you're looking, let's say, for a solution that's, let's say 1 mile away, okay?
Yeah.
If you get to a state, let's say maybe a half a mile away, okay, with your brute force search, and you apply your evaluation function, and it says the goal is at least 3/4 of a mile from that point to the goal, you can add those two together, and you don't have to keep exploring that state. So if you add how far you've gone to
Oh,
get to a
okay. I see.
particular state
Yeah.
to your estimated distance to the goal from that state,
Right.
and it's higher than the threshold of the path length you're looking at currently, then you can prune that off.
Yeah.
And to give you a more concrete example, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to the sliding tile puzzle because it's
Okay. Yeah.
easy.
That's okay. I'll try to
So
understand.
in the sliding tile puzzle, again, you've got 15 square tiles in a 4x4 frame, and one position is empty. That's called a blank. And you can move any tile that's adjacent, horizontally or vertically to the blank, into the blank position.
Okay. I think
And
I can kind of picture it now.
you want to rearrange it from some initial state to a particular goal state. I
Right.
should have
Yeah.
brought some
Okay.
props for this. Okay.
Yeah.
So and you want a shortest path ideally.
Yeah.
So a very simple heuristic for the sliding tile puzzle is take each tile in the current state and say, what is what's called the Manhattan distance from there to a goal? So you just count how many X moves and how many Y moves you have to make to get it to the goal for each individual tile. Okay.
Okay.
And if you add that up for all the tiles that are not in the correct place, the ones that are in their correct place, you get a 0. If you
Okay.
add that up, that turns out to be a lower bound on the number of moves because each of those tiles will have to move at least that distance.
Right. Right.
So that's another example of a lower bound or heuristic evaluation function.
Interesting.
And so what you can do now, if I'm looking, for example, is there a move that's is there a solution that's 5 moves away? And I'm doing my brute force search and I get to a state which is 3 moves away, but my heuristic says it takes at least 3 moves to get from that state to the goal. The sum of
Yeah.
those is 6. I don't have to look any further there. So that allows me to prune the search quite a bit.
Yeah. I see.
So those are the two basic ideas that are used to solve, these. I mean, there's all kinds of bells and whistles, but those are two
Yeah.
very fundamental basic ideas that are used to solve these problems.
Were there any other like significant problem solving like challenges you had to, I guess, or like unexpected things that came up while you were creating this that you had to kind of overcome or think of like
Yes.
ingenious solution? And you can share whichever you think is going to be relevant.
Sure. So this is something I ran into actually when I was doing my thesis work. The,
Okay.
the algorithm I just described in terms of it's called a breadth first search, which is you generate all the states 1 move away, then all the moves 2 moves away, all the moves 3 moves away.
Yeah.
Okay. The way you normally implement that is you put those states on a queue and it's a first in, first out queue. So what you're doing is you're storing all those states and then moving forward as you go. Okay, and you store them in memory. And what happens is that tends to fill up memory very fast. Okay, in a matter of minutes,
Okay.
you've exhausted your memory typically. and then your algorithm grinds to a halt. So one of the problems I ran into very early on was, how do I do deeper searches without exhausting memory? Because I was happy to run my program, over lunch, over dinner, over a few days, a few weeks, whatever. But I wasn't able to do that with the existing breadth first search algorithm, because what it does, it stores all the states you need, all the states you generate. So I came up with an algorithm which is called depth first iterative deepening, to allow you to essentially simulate that same algorithm using very little memory. And I kind of described it, which is, if you're looking for the states at a given distance, there's a way of generating those states in memory which is only linear in the depth, and it's called a depth first search. Okay, and depth first iterative deepening is, you do a sequence of these depth first searches. First you look at level one, then level two, level three, and that removes essentially the space problem. And then you can also apply it to using a heuristic function as well.
Interesting. Okay. So, I guess one of the things I wanted to ask is these kind of like problem solving strategies, especially the heuristics and some of the other techniques that you explained. And I know we mentioned just now like the Tesla example and like autopilot and how that's kind of relevant in that field, but are there any other like real world like places or like problems or issues that you think like this kind of like problem solving and these kind of techniques are especially relevant to?
Sure, it's used in an area called planning, where what you're trying to do, for example, is to figure out how to solve some particular problem, and you have a set of sort of operations you can apply, okay, to solve some. So let's say I want to plan a trip from here to a conference in Montreal or something, right?
Okay.
There's
Yeah.
various sorts of operators I need to apply, and they're very different. There's flights, car trips to get to the airport and back.
Yeah.
There's transportation from the airport to where I'm going. So all these are operators, right? So this is an example, kind of a real world example of planning, right? Where you plan a trip and you have to figure out the sequence of operations that'll get you from one place to another. Another application is what's called sequence alignment in computational biology. So if you look at the genomes of, let's say, a modern human and a Neanderthal, we actually have Neanderthal DNA now, and you want to ask, how similar are these genomes, right?
Yeah.
There's a technique which involves essentially a search where you try to compare the genomes to each other. I'm not going to go into all the
Right.
details of it, but
Okay.
it can be used for aligning the genomes of different species or different individuals in the same species to identify the differences and the commonalities between them. So that paradigm of doing sort of problem-solving search is kind of ubiquitous.
Right.
And all kinds of problems are different,
Yeah.
that paradigm is, it was developed in the mid '70s, and it's in fact, actually, it's developed in the late '50s, early '60s, but it is continued to be a dominant paradigm for problem solving by computers,
Okay.
and
So
as a model of how humans solve problems as well.
okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, as a professor, I guess from your perspective, I wanted to ask, what are some of the most like common like strategies or mistakes really that you see people making when they're trying to use like AI or like algorithms to kind of solve complex problems? If, if that makes
Um, that's a very broad question.
Yeah, and you
The
can
one
kind
thing
of
is,
yeah.
if you're going to use a tool to do something, you really want to be expert in the use of that tool.
Okay.
So you really don't want, so a mistake people sometimes make is they try to use some tool to do something, and they don't really know the tool very well. And that's kind of a broad class of mistakes that
Okay.
people make. Okay, so that's an example of something. I mean, you make mistakes all the time. I mean, the,
Right.
the nature of research is you try things,
Yeah.
and most of them don't work, frankly.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of, even doing research in some sense is kind of like problem solving search, because you're trying different things,
Yeah.
looking for a result, and most of them are dead ends and they just don't go anywhere.
Yeah.
And then you're looking for a particular, so there's sort of a meta application of the idea of problem solving to even
Yeah.
doing research on problem solving, even, if you will.
Yeah. And it's funny enough, I actually did an interview on my neuroscience podcast just a few hours earlier, and the professor was kind of talking about how he was trying to run an experiment showing dopamine processing in mice and kind of like its relationship with like food. And then what turned out to be like what they thought was bad data turned out to show like a very important distinction in neural processes between liking something and wanting something and how they're actually two very different processes. And scientists used to think they were like very similar. but now they're kind of like their own separate like things. So I think it's interesting that you've mentioned how
We
research
make
can be
mistakes all
unexpected.
the time,
Yeah. And
and I've
sometimes
certainly
those
made them
mistakes
as
end
well.
up being like the like igniting something like I guess interesting for the future. So,
Yep.
speaking of research, do you have any kind of like examples of when you decide to keep refining a current approach versus stepping back and looking at like a different way to tackle something? And that's once again a broad question, I guess, but
So if something is continuing to work and bear fruit, you keep trying to refine it, right?
right.
If something just doesn't seem like it's going anywhere, then at some point you try a different tack. So it's whatever seems like it's promising. Okay.
Yeah.
And one thing that's kind of important in research is if you're getting, so the research I do is partly theoretical, but it's also empirical. I always implement the algorithms and look at them and see how they actually work. Okay. And often they don't work as you expect. Okay. And often, usually that's because there's a bug in the software. So you find the bug in the software.
Yeah.
Sometimes there's a bug in the algorithm, right? Something doesn't work the way you expect. And whenever that kind of happens, you really want to try to understand it because sometimes that turns out to be an interesting result in and of itself. Something that people thought ought to work turns out not. And then the
Right.
reason that it doesn't work often turns out to be interesting. So anomalous results are almost always worth pursuing because
Yeah.
they're either, just a bug in your code, which you're used to,
Right.
or they represent something that people didn't really understand before. And I have
Yeah.
examples where what I thought was initially was just a bug turned out to be a relatively deep idea and led to a new paper.
Yeah. That's good. Just like always exploring like the different like aspects of projects,
Yep.
yes. So, my last question for you is um what kind of like what's one sentence of advice that you would give to people like struggling with problem solving in terms of like computer science or AI or technology? Just one sentence based on your experience kind of throughout your life and throughout the projects and what you've decided like has worked best for you.
Be persistent. Don't give up. Right. Work hard. Be
Yeah.
persistent and really kind of hammer away at it.
Yeah. So,
The things that are worth achieving rarely come easily.
yeah, that's
So
that's powerful. And on that note, thank you for joining me today on the podcast and sharing your insights and experience, especially with the Rubik's Cube. I know that it might not have seemed like a typical interview for this podcast, but I think it's very interesting what you shared today, especially with the development of the first ever Rubik's Cube solving algorithm. And it was a pleasure having you on.
thanks for having me. I enjoyed it. So are we off at this point?
Yeah, yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and stop the
I
recording.
have a